I wanted to take a minute to talk about coffee. So, many of you know that coffee is not usually recommended by, let's say, the different kinds of holistic approaches to wellness, or just having like a natural living. Very often, not coffee per se as much as caffeine is not recommended, right? Now, in the Ayurvedic terms, you can have coffee. You can especially have coffee if you follow the principles of Ayurveda, which means that you will have it at a certain time and in a certain way. And of course, there's also always, anyone would say, a question of quantity, of course, and of quality as well. A high quality one, organic, you name it, fair trade, all of that is always, of course, what we want to aim for. And in Ayurvedic terms, only one of the doshas, when it comes to the body constitution, is really promoted to have coffee, which would be the kapha dosha, due to its tendencies more than anything else. So why is this? Let's just explain that for a second first of all, okay? So coffee in itself, its characteristics are specifically of the vata energy, but also it has effect on the pitta dosha, or the pitta kind of energy as well. And why is this? Well, it's because obviously its quality, and when it comes to how we ingest it, it is dry, astringent, bitter, and it's light compared to, for instance, hot chocolate that we would have, for instance, with milk then, right? It's actually the milk that would make it less light, of course. And also we drink it warm and it heats us up and it stimulates adrenaline, our stress hormone. And so all of these characteristics of coffee and the effect that it has on us relate to the two dosha, vata and pitta, right? Even the effect that the caffeine has on our organism is of both of these two energies. Number one, it then stimulates the adrenaline, which is quite the pitta effect, but also in a certain way then specifically vata, because it actually has us moving more and become maybe even jittery. It has our blood pumping around much faster all of a sudden. That's circulation, that's linked to vata, and many of you might even use it for this reason, or at least have noticed the effect on the transit or on your bowel movement. So it activates the bowel movement, and we go to the bathroom, which is also then directly linked to the movement. So vata, okay, it heats up the system. People who have issues with like acid reflux or even ulcers and things like that, they are recommended to stay away from coffee because it makes that worse, which is pitta. So as you can see, the whole idea of drinking coffee is very much of the vata and pitta energies. And so the reason that it's recommended for kapha when out of balance, more specifically, is because of the kapha tendencies that are all the opposite to this. So basically, a kapha person who is out of balance, who's gone into their tendencies of stagnation, of accumulation, and even mentally, so on, let's say, sadness, depression, these kind of things. Coffee can really have an balancing effect, okay? It warms up, dries out, heats up, stimulates, and also increases. Actually, what I've read then is that it increases the time that the dopamine stays in the brain. So it actually blocks dopamine from going into the body, which is, we get this accumulation basically of dopamine in the brain, which is also why we feel this stimulation of our inspiration. We feel good, we feel happy when we have a cup of coffee. So that is to balance out kapha. So this is why in Ayurveda it can be recommended to have coffee. Now, coffee is just like animal products or any type of food that we can take in, even alcohol, actually, ultimately. All of it is medicine. So used the right way, it can heal us, and used the wrong way, it can kill us, obviously. So I find that it's really interesting in this world where coffee is such a cultural thing. It's a subculture in itself. Whenever I speak about it, I even say, it's the whole kind of like hashtag, but first coffee kind of thing. And we're all very dependent on the coffee. And I am not going to say anything bad about it in the sense that I am a coffee drinker. Now, I try to be careful with coffee because I also know that me with issues, for instance, around sleep, for sure, if I would have a coffee later in the day, for instance, then I know for sure that my sleep would not be good. But I've also noticed that it gives me headaches and nausea if I actually have coffee after having had my first meal of the day. So as long as I'm on an empty stomach, it's fine, but as soon as I've eaten, it's not a good idea. Which is interesting because there's some people who would say the complete opposite to that. They cannot have coffee on an empty stomach. But that is also linked to the fact that because I have a main, let's say, kind of dominance of Pitta in my constitution, my digestive fire is pretty strong, which means that I digest things pretty well. So I started to look into hormones more specifically when I was working with the ladies in my program, Nourish, Balance, Thrive, where we focus on changing our habits, our routines in order to find balance again. All of this based on the Ayurvedic principles. And as I was diving deeper into hormones, that is not a topic of the Ayurvedic science because hormones were discovered in 1902. It doesn't mean that it's not taken care of in Ayurveda, because it is, and that is what I discovered as I was reading up on this more and becoming more knowledgeable on the subject. It is interesting how we talk about hormonal imbalances, and usually we focus on the hormone of question that is out of balance, and then we treat that kind of like separately to everything else. That's how we do it in Western medicine anyway, right? We treat one thing. We don't look for the root cause very much of it. We treat the symptom. When the symptom is gone, everything is fine, right? And a lot of people, a lot of women who have imbalance when it comes to hormones and their sexual hormones are not linking, for instance, this issue. So let's say everything linked to the menstrual cycle, all kinds of issues that we have with that, just even PMS and things like that. They're not really linking it to, like, let's say, drinking coffee very much, do they? Or even, let's say, sugar cravings to it. And when I was reading up on this and I realized how you really have to approach an hormonal imbalance on a holistic level, I understood in what way my own issues have always been linked to a root cause that I wasn't aware of. And that is what I realized when I stopped drinking coffee. So I decided, not only because of this, but this was a big reason. Okay, I'm going to stop coffee. And I said to myself, because I know what it's like when you decide to stop something that you're actually addicted to, even if you don't really think you are, that it just sounds a little bit too much of a mountain to just stop it. So I said to myself, I'm going to hold up for a week. I've done that before, which I have, and that was fine. And so I decided to do it for those reasons, but also actually for the fact that I was noticing some effects on me that were a little bit worrying. So I could notice, for instance, the sensation of depletion, even though I did feel like I had my energy levels. But whenever I had a moment of rest, I felt as if I needed much more rest. Or another thing that's definitely a sign is when you're having coffee and it's not really having the effect that it used to have. Obviously, the effect of coffee decreases over time, just like any other addiction that you have, which is why you increase the intake of it. But when you're as cautious as I am and not drinking that much, and all of a sudden you're noticing that you don't have that little pick me up when you have a coffee, it means that something is going on. It basically means that you're running on kind of overload. There's nothing underneath to actually help you to sustain you. So you're just using the caffeine in order to keep going, which means that you're just becoming more and more hollow, if you will, in a certain sense. So I decided to stop the coffee. And here is what I realized and noticed. So number one, I did have an addiction because I had the negative, let's say, effects of the severage. So for a couple of days, I was really experiencing the effects of not having coffee, of the heavy headache even, which I actually never have really. I was having a foggy mind, I was not thinking clearly, it was hard to concentrate, and I was feeling really weak. When I was exercising, I could do half, if even, of what I usually could. And when I would lay down for my shavasana, for my rest, for my recovery after exercise, I felt as if I would fall asleep. I had a very, very deep sense of the body relaxing, which I wasn't used to. Which brings me to the next point, which was that not only did I notice this, which passed after about 2 days or 3 maybe, and it then I then felt quite normal again. But what I noticed was that I don't even know if the addictions was so much of that physical as it was to a mental idea of who I am. Let me explain that. In my mind, I was really creative and inspired at a certain point in the morning. And that was the only part of the day that I would really be able to create. So that was essential for me to do at that time. It is still the case that I'm freshest at that kind of mid-morning kind of time. However, there is a huge difference because I wasn't really experiencing that peak of it when I wasn't having coffee. But I wasn't also experiencing the total crash that I could have in the mid-afternoon, when obviously the effect of the coffee had gone down and I had overdone it because I was borrowing energy, let's say, from the coffee that the body wasn't producing itself. So that was one thing that I realized, that actually that idea of who I am wasn't really my true personality. Does that make sense? So actually, my true personality has, let's say, this place here. And it can just be that way for the rest of the day. Whereas Charlotte on caffeine goes from here to here, and then kind of a little bit down to here, and then at some point stabilizes again. So actually, there's a reason that when we stop drinking coffee, we feel more ourselves. Because actually, when we're having caffeine, it's the same thing as when we're having another type of substance, like sugar, or let's say toxins, like cigarettes, alcohol, and drugs. We're altering our personality. So naturally, when you take that away, it's almost a little bit of a rediscovering of who you really are. And what I discovered was that a lot of the anxiety that I would experience in certain situations was gone. And what I was usually craving when I was in those states of anxiety, when I was worrying about this or that, especially about the future things, well, I became that person that I was always like, oh, I wish I could just be like that again when I feel calm. Because I can't even explain it. It was as if I was almost touching base with something that I known was me, but from many, many years ago. Almost a little bit like that parent that would comfort me as a child when I was anxious. So I was being actually that person to myself when I was not influenced by caffeine. Another thing that I noticed, and this one I find really quite incredible, and that is I've become so used to what caffeine does to my system that when I'm not on it and I'm just relaxed, I keep thinking that I'm tired. Oh, I'm tired, I'm tired. I wonder why I'm so tired. And then if I actually stop saying to myself that I'm tired, I realize that I'm just relaxed, actually. I'm just not high on adrenaline or cortisol, which will bring me into the next subject, which is so essential. Cortisol is our stress hormone that comes in once adrenaline has done its job, let's say. Adrenaline comes in as a kick more when there's like a surprise and when we're really in the fight or flight response to begin with. And then cortisol comes in so that we can maintain the state in our body of the stress. One of the effects, the negative effects of cortisol, is that it creates fat, and that fat goes around the belly. So there's a lot of women, for instance, more I would say women because I feel like they're more concerned about it, but for sure there's exactly the same effect on men, who walk around with this extra belly fat they feel. And then they work out even more and they push themselves even more and they restrain themselves even more from fat, for instance, when they eat, in order to try to reduce this. And what are they doing in order to keep themselves going when they're starving or when they don't have the energy because they're not eating enough? Well, they have caffeine, they have coffee, right? Intermittent fasting in itself is basically based on, at least in the beginning, I'm sure that someone who's been doing it for a very long time and who's really gotten used to it does not need the coffee maybe anymore. But to start with, in order to be able to reduce the meal intakes, a lot of people count on drinking coffee so that they can maintain. And so isn't that ironic that the same substance that they're staying addicted to in order to reduce the fat on their body is what creates fat on the body, and especially in the belly area. So I did notice just within the first 2 days, I'm not going to say like, oh, I reduced my belly fat and I noticed this. I can't really say that. I think that I would have to look at that like on a more long term because it's only been a week. And I'm going to maintain it, by the way, longer. That's what I was going to come to after this. But what I can say is that I straight away, within 1 day, 2 days, I felt more firm in my body. So that has something to do with it. I could feel my muscles engaging differently. I find that quite interesting. And so this is what I wanted to get to, this idea of I decided I would do it for a week to see. And the more I was looking into this, the more I actually realized that I think probably my caffeine intake is playing on my hormonal imbalances. So I should probably not really have coffee anymore, or at least not every day. For the time being, I have no desire to go back to coffee right now, so I'm definitely going to maintain this. And I'm not going to be counting as I've done now. I was checking that I've done a week and a day today, because I started last Monday. But especially after a few days, when you're getting used to yourself again, to this is really who I am, then I'm back at doing my physical activity like I did it before when I had coffee. And I'm also back at being as productive in the morning as I was when I was having coffee as well, basically. So I'm fine with not having it. What's interesting though is that it's affecting me, and I think many of us, on a level of there's that cup in the morning that's like a hug that comes in and embraces us and makes us feel good. And in that sense, we should really maybe ask ourselves, why do I need that to feel good in the morning? Is there a way that I can investigate in that need to see where that's coming from in order to actually heal it, instead of just trying to, put a plaster on it and pretend that it's not there? And also being able to feel things, because what does that do? Yeah, that cup of joe, that warmness, that hug me. It does put you in a better mood to start the day. And this is why it helps kapha people when they're out of balance and they're just low and they don't even want to get out of bed. Yeah, then it's a good moment. But not to let it become a crutch, because then at one point it's even like, okay, so when the caffeine goes down and I'm starting to feel that crash, what do? Well, I get another cup of coffee and then I get up there again. And so never do I allow myself to be down here, which physically is detrimental, which the cortisol as well has its side as well to that. And it does not allow for me to actually sit with the discomfort that is. So all of these people talking about healing, right? And go. Skipping those noises. The shadow work, the dark night of the soul. Well, if they're having coffee, I'm not sure they're really embracing their shadow and their dark night of the soul. Now, I'm not saying to that if you're not stopping coffee, then you won't be able to look into your shadow and all of that. That's not what I'm saying. It's just a reflection around how addicted we are to stay on a certain mood, and that if we're not, it's as if there's something wrong with us. The last thing I want to mention, I'm just checking how long I've been speaking, that's long, is that I was listening to a famous or well-known, well-respected doctor who focuses on hormones. And he was asked the question, is coffee bad for my hormones? And his answer was, no, only if it affects your sleep. But then I can't help but thinking, since coffee will stimulate your adrenaline, and then a consistent drinking of coffee will therefore then enhance your cortisol, does not that play on your hormonal imbalances after all? Because even if it doesn't affect your sleep because the caffeine is out of your body, I still feel as if we're triggering cortisol, then naturally we are beginning to trigger all kinds of hormones in our body. And if we're acting from the personality on caffeine, and that we're actually overdoing it when our real self is not okay with it, aren't we also affecting our adrenal glands? Because that's exactly what adrenal fatigue comes from. And as we affect our adrenal glands, we progressively begin to affect our pancreas. and so our insulin levels, the blood sugar levels, and then progressively thyroid, and then of course the reproductive organs. But that's obviously only if we, continue for a long time. Like, people who drink coffee every day for years and years and their whole life.